Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we drift into the dark, chilling corridors of history, exploring the most notorious serial killers of medieval times and more. These are the stories that remind us how fragile life was in an age ruled by swords, superstition, and shadows. Stay with me as we uncover tales that are equal parts terrifying, fascinating, and unforgettable. Imagine stepping into a world so vastly different from our own that even the simplest aspects of life feel foreign. Picture narrow, muddy streets where the stench of waste lingers in the air, where torchlight flickers against stone walls at night, and where whispers of danger spread through small, tight-knit communities. There are no street lamps, no organized police forces, no fingerprint analysis, no forensic science, no cameras to catch a fleeting shadow. The medieval era was a world of mystery, superstition, faith, and fear, and in this world lived people who were capable of unspeakable crimes, people whose names and deeds have echoed across centuries. To understand why certain figures became known as the most notorious killers of their time, we must first immerse ourselves in the society they thrived in, because only then can we see how the cracks in the structure of medieval life allowed monsters to roam free, often unnoticed until it was far too late. The medieval period, stretching roughly from the 5th century after the fall of Rome until the dawn of the Renaissance in the 15th century, is often romanticized as an age of chivalrous knights, noble ladies, grand castles, and epic battles. We imagine tournaments, shining armor, the sound of lutes, and stories of heroism. But beneath that polished imagery lies another truth. It was also a time of immense suffering, fear, and violence. Disease was rampant, poverty widespread, and justice brutal yet inconsistent. Entire villages could be wiped out by plague or famine, and in the chaos of such a world, it was all too easy for predators to thrive. Life was short, often cruel, and often uncertain, and within this uncertainty lurked individuals who preyed upon the weak, the desperate, and the voiceless. In such an environment, the very concept of a serial killer was barely understood. Today, with modern psychology, we classify and study these patterns of behavior. We analyze motives, methods, and psychological profiles. But in medieval times, when people went missing or bodies were discovered, explanations often leaned toward the supernatural or divine punishment rather than human cruelty. If a child disappeared from a village, the common belief might be that wolves had dragged them away, or that witches had stolen them for rituals, or even that the devil himself had claimed them. Rarely did people immediately suspect one of their own neighbors. This mindset created fertile ground for killers to hide in plain sight, committing crime after crime without arousing suspicion, protected not just by their cunning, but by the very limitations of medieval understanding. The legal systems of the time were patchy and inconsistent. In some regions, local lords held the authority of judge, jury, and executioner. In others, traveling magistrates or church officials oversaw trials. But one thing was consistent across much of Europe. Punishment was often swift, brutal, and public, but the investigation leading to those punishments was rarely thorough. Torture was a common method of extracting confessions, whether true or false, and accusations could be enough to send someone to their death. In such a climate, truly intelligent or well-connected killers could escape justice simply by leveraging their position, wealth, or reputation. If people feared them or respected them, it could be years before their crimes were uncovered. If they were uncovered at all, religion dominated every aspect of medieval life. The church was not just a place of worship, but the moral compass of society, the keeper of knowledge, and often the arbiter of law. To commit crimes against others was seen as not just a violation of social order, but a direct sin against God. This meant that when the unimaginable occurred, when multiple murders were suspected, people did not always look for psychological or rational explanations. Instead, they often concluded that Satan was at work through human vessels. Killers were branded as witches, werewolves, or servants of the devil. This merging of superstition with crime created legends that continue to shape how we perceive medieval murderers even today. Some of these individuals may have been guilty beyond doubt, while others may have been scapegoats caught in a web of rumor and hysteria. But either way, their reputations as monsters were sealed in history. Life in a medieval village was fragile, and so was trust. Most communities were small, where everyone knew each other. Families worked together in fields. Children played under the watchful eyes of neighbors, and survival often depended on collective cooperation. Yet, it was in these tight-knit societies that the greatest betrayals could occur. If someone from within the community began preying on others, suspicion would grow slowly, almost reluctantly, because to accuse someone you knew of such horrors was unthinkable. That hesitation gave predators time to manipulate, time to hide their tracks, and time to strike again. And if the killer was not a peasant, but someone of noble birth or wealth, the gap between classes made accusations even harder to voice. Who would dare question a lord or lady who controlled the land, the food, and the soldiers who enforced their rule? The medieval mindset also shaped how victims were seen. The poor, the homeless, the orphans, and the powerless were considered expendable by many in society. When such individuals vanished, there was little outcry. Their lives were cheap in the eyes of their communities, and killers knew this. They targeted those least likely to be missed, those whose absence would not provoke powerful questions. This dark reality explains how some killers amassed staggering numbers of victims before their crimes were noticed. Fear spread quickly in medieval times, but truth moved slowly. Without newspapers, without formal police reports, without reliable record keeping, most of what people knew came from word of mouth. Stories traveled from village to village, often growing more exaggerated with each retelling. A single murder could become 10, and 10 could become 100 by the time the tale reached another region. This made it difficult then, and even now, for historians to separate fact from myth. Did certain killers truly murder hundreds, or were they symbols of a broader fear, their legends inflated by rumor? This blending of fact and folklore is what makes studying medieval killers so haunting. But despite the difficulty in separating myth from reality, what is undeniable is the sheer terror they inspired. Imagine being a peasant farmer hearing whispers that children in the next village had gone missing, never to return. Imagine merchants on the road warning each other of bandits who not only robbed but dismembered travelers for rituals. Imagine hearing the church preach that werewolves and witches lived among you, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the cover of night to reveal their true form. The medieval world was already terrifying enough with plague, famine, and war. To add human monsters into the mix was almost too much to bear, and yet, perhaps that is why stories of these killers survived. They represented something people needed to believe, that evil had a face, that it wasn't random plague or famine taking loved ones, but a tangible enemy that could be caught and punished. In a way, serial killers became the personification of fear itself. Their stories amplified not just because of the lives they destroyed, but because of the psychological need for people to understand and name their suffering. As we peel back the layers of history, we find that these killers were not isolated figures, but products of their time. The medieval world created the conditions in which they thrived: the lack of law enforcement, the unquestioned authority of the nobility, the blind spots of superstition, the vulnerability of the poor, and the desperation of communities, already burdened by disease and war. Together, these factors formed a backdrop against which some of the darkest figures in history emerged. Their stories are not only tales of cruelty, but also windows into the fears and flaws of medieval society. To speak of them is not to glorify their deeds, but to remember how fragile human life was in that time and how easily evil could walk unnoticed among ordinary people. The most notorious serial killers of medieval times remind us that history is not just knights and kings, but also shadows and whispers, terrors and tragedies that lived alongside the grandeur. They remind us that every age, no matter how distant, has faced its own darkness. And so, as we journey into the lives of these infamous figures, we must remember that their crimes cannot be separated from the world they inhabited. A world where truth was fragile, justice uncertain, and evil often hidden in plain sight. Once celebrated as a knight and national hero, Gilles de Rais stands as one of the most chilling figures to emerge from the pages of medieval history. To understand the depth of his story, one must first imagine the stage upon which he lived. France in the early 1400s was a country torn by war, famine, and fear. The 100 Years' War raged between France and England, leaving the land scarred, villages burned, and ordinary people caught in the endless violence of armies clashing over thrones and power. Amidst this chaos, a young man from one of the wealthiest and most noble families in Brittany rose to fame, fighting bravely at the side of Joan of Arc, that miraculous teenage girl who inspired the French to push back against the English invaders. Gilles was admired, celebrated, and revered. His name became associated with victory, loyalty, and nobility. Yet behind this mask of honor, he was slowly becoming one of the most infamous murderers history has ever recorded. Born in 1405, Gilles de Rais came from immense wealth. His family controlled vast lands, and when his parents died young, Gilles inherited an enormous fortune. By the time he was a teenager, he was already one of the richest men in France, with castles, servants, and armies under his command. He was well educated, schooled in Latin, in the arts, and in the traditions of chivalry. To many, he embodied the ideal of what a medieval nobleman should be. When Joan of Arc appeared and rallied French forces, Gilles fought valiantly by her side. Chroniclers describe him as a man of great courage and energy, a shining figure on the battlefield. He was even named a Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors of the time. But power, as history shows again and again, has a way of corrupting. After Joan's capture and execution, Gilles retreated from the battlefield. He withdrew into a life of luxury within his castles, surrounding himself with art, theater, and extravagant pageantry. He spent money recklessly, funding lavish plays, building ornate chapels, and living as though his fortune were endless. In reality, he was burning through his wealth at a dangerous pace. But behind the glitter of his performances and his reputation as a patron of the arts, Gilles was sinking into a world of obsession, darkness, and hidden desires that would eventually shock all of France. Rumors began to spread quietly at first. Children who had been seen near his estates vanished, never to be found again. Parents whispered that their sons and daughters had gone missing after encountering Gilles's men, who were said to lure them with promises of work, food, or adventure. Villagers grew uneasy, but few dared to voice their suspicions openly. How could a nobleman of such high standing, one who had fought for France's salvation, be accused of harming innocent children? To speak such things against a man of his power was dangerous, and in an age when peasants had little voice, their fears often went unheard. But over time, the whispers could no longer be ignored. When Gilles's fortune began to dwindle, he turned increasingly to practices that alarmed even his peers. He delved into alchemy and the occult, seeking ways to restore his wealth through supernatural means. He hired strange men, magicians, clerics, and sorcerers who promised to summon demons or transmute metals into gold. These rituals, often conducted at night in his castles, deepened his reputation for strangeness. What his neighbors did not yet realize was that his descent into occult practices ran parallel to something far darker: his crimes against the most vulnerable. Historical records from his trial reveal horrifying details. Gilles is said to have abducted children, mostly boys, sometimes girls, often the sons and daughters of peasants who lived on his lands. He or his servants would lure them into the castle with promises of food, clothing, or employment. Once inside, they would never emerge alive. Testimonies described scenes of unimaginable cruelty. The children were assaulted, tortured, and murdered, their bodies desecrated in ways too graphic for many to even comprehend. Gilles, it is said, reveled in these acts, finding a twisted form of pleasure in their suffering. In some accounts, he was compared to a hunter, watching with satisfaction as his prey was destroyed. The numbers vary, as with most medieval cases where rumor and fact intermingle. Some sources claim he killed dozens, others hundreds. The trial documents suggest over 100 victims, though exact figures will never be known. What is chilling is not only the crimes themselves, but the way Gilles managed to conceal them for so long. His wealth and power shielded him, and the fear of challenging a nobleman prevented many families from speaking out. Moreover, in a time when death was common and children often disappeared due to war, disease, or poverty, his crimes blended into the chaos of the era. It was only when his reckless spending and bizarre behavior drew scrutiny that the darker truth began to surface. By 1440, Gilles's debts had mounted to catastrophic levels. He sold lands, dismissed servants, and quarreled with neighbors and church officials. His erratic behavior caught the attention of both secular and ecclesiastical authorities. When a local priest accused him publicly, the matter could no longer be hidden. An investigation began, and what it uncovered horrified the entire region. Testimonies from servants and accomplices painted a picture of a man who had fallen utterly into depravity, a man whose outward image of nobility concealed a monstrous reality. His trial was one of the most sensational of the age. Held in Nantes, it drew crowds eager to hear the shocking details. Gilles, once honored as a war hero, now stood accused of heresy, murder, sodomy, and occult practices. Witnesses described the abductions, the screams of children within castle walls, the mutilated remains, the rituals that mingled cruelty with superstition. It was a spectacle of horror, and the court, both secular and church, pressed relentlessly for confession. At first, Gilles resisted, denying the charges, but as evidence mounted and torture was threatened, he broke. He confessed in chilling detail, describing his crimes with a mixture of shame, resignation, and perhaps even pride. His execution was swift and symbolic. In October 1440, he was hanged and burned in front of a massive crowd. Some accounts say he expressed remorse before his death, urging onlookers to protect their children from the kind of evil he had embodied. Others suggest he met his end defiantly, unrepentant. Regardless of his final words, his legacy was sealed. Gilles de Rais, once a knight of France, now remembered as one of the most notorious killers in history. Yet even here, the story does not rest quietly. Some historians have raised questions about the trial. Was Gilles guilty of all the crimes attributed to him, or was he a victim of political enemies eager to seize his wealth and land? It is true that trials in the 15th century were often shaped by power, corruption, and the desire to eliminate rivals. Some argue that while Gilles may have engaged in strange or occult practices, the scale of his crimes may have been exaggerated. His reputation as a child murderer might have been magnified by enemies who wished to destroy him. The blending of superstition with factalchemy, sorcery, demons makes it difficult to know where the truth lies. Nevertheless, the weight of the evidence suggests that, guilty or not, Gilles became a symbol of the ultimate fall from grace. From the heights of honor, fighting alongside Joan of Arc, to the depths of infamy, executed as a murderer and heretic, his story encapsulates the extremes of human nature in the medieval world. He represents how power can corrupt, how wealth can conceal evil, and how societies struggling with fear and superstition can produce legends that endure long after the individuals are gone. The tale of Gilles de Rais haunted Europe for centuries. His name entered folklore, inspiring comparisons to later fictional monsters. Some scholars even suggest he influenced the legends of Bluebeard, the nobleman who murdered his wives in fairy tales. Whether fact or myth, his story became a cautionary tale about the dangers hidden beneath nobility and honor. He was not the starving bandit on the roadside, nor the superstitious peasant accused of witchcraft. He was a knight, a marshal of France, a man entrusted with the nation's battles, and yet he became a predator in his own halls. In many ways, Gilles de Rais personifies the contradictions of the medieval world. He was both a patron of the arts and a destroyer of innocence, both a hero and a villain, both celebrated and despised. His life and crimes remind us that history is not divided neatly into light and darkness, but often entangled in shadows where great deeds and horrific acts coexist. For the peasants whose children never returned, he was no ambiguous figure. He was the nightmare that wore the mask of nobility, the wolf who dressed in armor. For us, looking back across centuries, his story is a window into how the medieval world confronted evil and how it sometimes failed to see it until it was too late. And so, as his body turned to ash in the public square, the people of Nantes believed they had destroyed a monster. But what they truly left behind was something more enduring, a legend of fallen nobility, a reminder of the fragility of innocence, and a story that still chills the imagination 6 centuries later. Elisabeth Báthory was born into power, privilege, and prestige. She came from one of the most influential noble families of 16th century Hungary, a clan that wielded immense political clout in Central Europe. From birth in 1560, she was surrounded by wealth, servants, and castles, and the paths of her future seemed carved in stone. She was destined to marry well, inherit land, and reinforce the strength of her lineage. Yet her name would come to be remembered not for her nobility or her political significance, but for the horrifying crimes she allegedly committed. To this day, Elisabeth Báthory remains one of the most infamous figures in European history, remembered as the Blood Countess. A woman whose appetite for cruelty and murder became the stuff of legend. To understand her life, one must first imagine the Hungary of her time. It was an era of political instability, threatened constantly by Ottoman invasions and torn by internal disputes among the nobility. Fortresses were not simply symbols of power, but also essential for survival in a land ravaged by conflict. Against this backdrop of constant warfare and social upheaval, Elisabeth lived in a world where violence was normal, cruelty was common, and the lives of peasants and servants were considered expendable by the ruling elite. This environment provided fertile ground for excesses of power to flourish unchecked. From an early age, Elisabeth displayed intelligence, cunning, and pride. She received an education far superior to most women of her time, learning Latin, German, Hungarian, and even Greek. She studied politics, etiquette, and the management of estates. Her literacy and wit made her exceptional, and she was often described as strikingly beautiful, commanding attention wherever she went. At the age of 15, she married Ferenc Nadasdy, a powerful Hungarian nobleman who would later gain fame as the Black Knight of Hungary for his cruelty on the battlefield against the Ottomans. Their marriage united two of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the region, solidifying Elizabeth's position as one of the most influential women of her time. Ferenc was frequently away at war, and Elizabeth was left to manage vast estates and hundreds of servants. It was during these years that whispers of her darker tendencies began to emerge. While her husband was known for his brutal treatment of enemies, Elizabeth reportedly directed her cruelty inward upon the peasants and servants under her control. There are accounts of punishments that far exceeded the norms of the time. Servants beaten savagely, burned with irons, or left to suffer in the cold. Some of these stories may have been fueled by gossip, but the consistency of the reports suggests a woman with a growing appetite for domination and pain. When Ferenc died in 1604, Elizabeth was left a widow at 44 years old, still wealthy, still powerful, but now without the protection of her husband. It was after his death that the accusations of her crimes escalated to staggering proportions. According to testimony gathered years later, Elizabeth began luring young peasant girls into her castle under the pretense of offering them work. These girls would then be subjected to torture and death. Some accounts claim she bit chunks of flesh from their bodies, others that she burned them with candles or needles, or beat them to death in fits of rage. The most infamous legend of all is that Elizabeth bathed in the blood of virgins, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty. Whether this gruesome ritual truly occurred or was invented later as a symbol of her vanity, the image of the Blood Countess immersed in scarlet baths became one of the most enduring legends in European folklore. Testimonies collected during the investigations describe scenes of unimaginable horror within the walls of her castle at Szeged. Witnesses claimed they found bodies buried in shallow graves, others stuffed into secret chambers. Servants testified against her, describing how they were forced to assist in disposing of corpses or cleaning up after nights of cruelty. The numbers of her victims vary wildly depending on the source. Some claim she murdered dozens, others hundreds, and in the most sensational accounts, over 600 girls. While the highest numbers are likely exaggerations fueled by rumor, even the lower estimates paint a chilling picture of systematic cruelty carried out over many years. Yet, as with many figures of the medieval and early modern world, the line between fact and myth is blurred. Some historians argue that Elisabeth Báthory was the victim of a political conspiracy. She was immensely wealthy and controlled lands that the Hungarian crown coveted. By accusing her of heinous crimes, King Matthias Roman II and rival nobles could justify seizing her estates and weakening the Báthory family's power. The trial records, preserved by her enemies, may have been embellished or even fabricated. After all, confessions were often extracted under torture, and servants eager to save themselves may have exaggerated or invented stories to please the investigators. Still, the sheer volume of testimony and the physical evidence of mutilated bodies found around her estates make it difficult to dismiss all the accusations as mere invention. Even if the lurid tales of blood bathing were fictional, there seems little doubt that Elizabeth engaged in acts of cruelty and violence that shocked her contemporaries. Her trial, conducted in 1610 and 1611, became a spectacle with dozens of witnesses brought forth to testify. She herself was never formally convicted in a court, likely because her noble status made it politically dangerous to execute her. Instead, she was confined within her own castle, walled up in a chamber where she lived out the last years of her life. For 4 years, she remained imprisoned in her fortress, isolated from the world, until her death in 1614. Some accounts say she wasted away, tormented by her own conscience, while others insist she remained cold and defiant to the end. When her body was discovered, she had reportedly left little behind but questions about the extent of her crimes, about the truth of the legends, and about the motives of those who destroyed her. The legend of Elisabeth Báthory grew long after her death, transforming her into something larger than life. Writers, poets, and chroniclers painted her as the archetype of female vanity and cruelty. In later centuries, she became associated with vampire folklore, her supposed bloodbaths linking her to the undead creatures of Eastern European myth. Bram Stoker's Dracula was likely influenced by her story, and countless films, novels, and works of art have drawn upon her dark legacy. She remains a figure of fascination, simultaneously monstrous and tragic, a woman of immense power who became a symbol of unchecked cruelty. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere between the extremes. Elisabeth Báthory may not have murdered 600 girls, and she may not have bathed in blood, but it is likely she was guilty of systematic abuse and cruelty toward those beneath her. Her wealth and position allowed her to act with impunity, shielded from scrutiny until her crimes became impossible to ignore. At the same time, her downfall was certainly convenient for her enemies, who were eager to dismantle her influence and claim her estates. Thus, history remembers her both as a killer and as a pawn in the ruthless politics of her time. What makes her story so chilling, even centuries later, is the intersection of power, gender, and violence. In a world where women were rarely given authority, Elisabeth Báthory wielded enormous influence, and instead of using it for protection or legacy, she allegedly turned it into a weapon of terror. She represents the nightmare of absolute power in the hands of someone with no compassion. And whether or not every detail of her crimes is true, the fact that her name has endured in infamy shows how deeply her story struck fear into the hearts of her contemporaries. In the end, the Blood Countess stands as both a historical figure and a mythic archetype. To some, she was a monstrous killer, a predator who destroyed innocent lives for pleasure. To others, she was a victim of political scheming, demonized by her rivals to strip her family of power. Between these extremes lies a complex and unsettling truth. Elisabeth Báthory was a woman of extraordinary wealth and influence in a violent and unstable world, and whether by her own hand or by the machinations of her enemies, her life became a story of horror that has endured for 4 centuries. Her castle may have fallen into ruins, her body returned to the earth, but her legend lives on. The Blood Countess remains one of the most notorious names in the annals of history, a reminder of how power can corrupt, how cruelty can be hidden behind noble walls, and how stories of darkness, once born, never truly die. In the shadowed corners of medieval Europe, where superstition mixed freely with faith, and fear of the unknown stalked the imagination of the common people, the stories of werewolves and witches carried as much weight as the holy scriptures themselves. Monsters were not just figures in folklore, they were seen as living, breathing threats that could lurk in the next village, the next forest, or even within the guise of a neighbor. It was in this atmosphere of dread that some of the most notorious killers in European history thrived, cloaked in the legends of shapeshifters and creatures of the night. Among them, 2 names stood out: Peter Nears, the black magician turned mass murderer, and Peter Stump, forever remembered as the werewolf of Bedburg. Together, their stories represent the terrifying fusion of crime, myth, and paranoia in the late medieval and early modern worlds. Peter Nears was born sometime in the early 16th century, and like many figures who would later be accused of sorcery and monstrous acts, little is known of his childhood. What is remembered, however, is his reputation as a robber, a killer, and above all, a practitioner of the black arts. He was said to have apprenticed under a notorious sorcerer, where he learned spells, incantations, and rituals that gave him powers beyond mortal men. As the stories went, he could make himself invisible, summon demons to do his bidding, and even transform into animals at will. These claims, whether born of truth or of the imagination of terrified peasants, ensured that his name would be whispered in fear across the German lands for generations. By the mid-1500s, Nears had become the leader of a feared band of brigands who terrorized the countryside, preying on travelers, merchants, and peasants alike. He and his men were accused of committing robberies, murders, and assaults, leaving trails of blood wherever they went. But it was not the thefts that gave Nears his infamy. It was the ritualistic nature of his supposed crimes. Authorities claimed he murdered pregnant women in order to carve unborn fetuses from their wombs, using their remains for magical practices. Tales spread that he collected the hearts of his victims to perform dark rites, and that his pact with the devil gave him unnatural strength and cunning. These lurid accusations painted him not just as a killer, but as something more, a man who had abandoned his humanity and embraced a monstrous identity. The fear surrounding him grew to such proportions that when he was first captured in 1577, people believed his execution would rid the land of evil itself. But Peter Nears managed to escape, allegedly aided by demonic forces, and for the next decade continued his reign of terror. Every new murder discovered in the forests of Germany seemed to be attributed to him. Some chroniclers claimed his victim count numbered in the hundreds, though these numbers, inflated by rumor, were impossible to verify. What mattered was not the accuracy of the figures, but the impression they left, that Nears was a predator beyond comprehension, a human beast who thrived on cruelty. His final capture in 1581 was accompanied by hysteria. When he was taken into custody, authorities supposedly found grisly relics in his possession, magical items, strange ointments, and the remains of his victims, preserved for sorcery. The charges against him included not only robbery and murder, but also cannibalism, infanticide, and witchcraft. His trial was a spectacle designed to terrify the public and reinforce the message that evil would not be tolerated. The execution that followed was as gruesome as his reputation demanded. Over the course of 3 days, his body was mutilated piece by piece, first his flesh torn with red-hot pincers, then his limbs broken on the wheel, and finally his body burned to ash. It was a punishment intended not just to destroy the man, but to annihilate the monster his legend had created. But even as Peter Nears perished in fire and agony, the tales of his sorcery and his pact with the devil lived on, feeding into the wider folklore of shapeshifters and werewolves that gripped Europe. For in the same era, another figure emerged whose crimes blurred the line between human cruelty and mythic monstrosity. Peter Stump, remembered forever as the werewolf of Bedburg, Stump lived in late 16th century Germany in the Rhineland town of Bedburg. It was a time of turmoil. Religious wars between Catholics and Protestants ravaged the land, famine and plague brought misery, and the forests around villages were thick with fearsome legends. In this anxious world, rumors began to spread of a monstrous wolf that prowled the countryside, slaughtering livestock, women, and children. Farmers found their animals eviscerated. Peasants whispered of screams in the night, and mutilated bodies began to turn up on the edges of fields. The creature responsible, they said, was no ordinary beast. It was a werewolf, a man who had traded his soul for the power of a ravening predator. When suspicion finally fell on Peter Stump, the revelations were worse than anything the villagers had imagined. According to his confession, extracted under torture, Stump admitted to practicing black magic since the age of 12, when he supposedly made a pact with the devil. The devil, he claimed, had given him a magical belt that allowed him to transform into a wolf whenever he wished. In this shape, he prowled the countryside, seizing prey, devouring children, and tearing apart women. He admitted to killing and eating livestock, peasants, and even members of his own family. The confessions painted him as both man and monster, a predator whose hunger knew no bounds. Among the most horrifying accusations was that Stump had engaged in incest with his daughter, committed acts of cannibalism, and murdered his own son, devouring his brains. His depravity seemed limitless, his crimes carefully embroidered by both his torturers and the public imagination. Whether he truly believed himself to be a werewolf or was simply broken under the cruelty of interrogation, his trial became a defining moment in the hysteria of witch hunts and werewolf trials that swept through Europe. The execution of Peter Stump in 1589 was staged with maximum brutality, designed as a public warning against both crime and heresy. Accounts describe how his body was strapped to a wheel, his flesh torn with hot pincers, his limbs broken with iron hammers, and his head cut off before his body was burned. His mistress and daughter, accused of sharing in his crimes, were executed alongside him. The town of Bedburg, like much of Europe, wanted not just to punish, but to erase the evil they believed had walked among them. The stories of Nears and Stump reveal not only the brutality of their crimes, but also the anxieties of the societies that condemned them. Medieval and early modern Europe was a world in which the supernatural and the real were inseparable. When a murderer preyed upon the innocent, it was easier for people to believe he was a demon in disguise than to accept that ordinary men could be capable of such horrors. The myths of werewolves, witches, and sorcerers offered a framework for understanding evil, even as they obscured the real human capacity for violence. Yet, there is no denying that men like Peter Nears and Peter Stump were more than just legends. Stripped of their supernatural trappings, their crimes were very real: robbery, torture, rape, murder, and cannibalism. They were predators in a society that struggled to protect its weakest members, and the terror they inspired was amplified by the cultural lens of the time. When we look back on their stories today, we see both the monstrous killers they were accused of being and the powerful myths that society built around them. In the end, their names endure not because of the exact number of their victims or the precision of historical records, but because they became symbols of a deeper fear, that within every man lurks the potential for monstrous cruelty. Nears, the sorcerer who carved unborn children for his black rituals, and Stump, the farmer who wore the skin of a wolf to feed his endless hunger, became the embodiment of the werewolf myth, the idea that evil was not just outside the village, lurking in the forest, but within men themselves. Hidden behind ordinary faces, waiting for the chance to emerge, Gilles de Rais was born in 1405 into the upper echelons of French nobility, a child destined for greatness. His family, one of the most distinguished in Brittany, was wealthy, powerful, and deeply entangled in the turbulent politics of the 100 Years' War. From the beginning, Gilles's path seemed marked by privilege and opportunity. He inherited immense estates, received an education fit for princes, and possessed all the makings of a shining star of France's aristocracy. To many, he was destined for military glory, and for a time he achieved just that. As a young man, Gilles became known for his bravery on the battlefield. His greatest claim to fame was his role as one of the commanders in the army of Joan of Arc. In 1429, at the age of 24, he fought alongside her in the campaign that lifted the siege of Orleans, a pivotal moment that helped turn the tide of the war in France's favor. Gilles was praised for his courage, his martial skill, and his loyalty to the cause. He was even rewarded with the prestigious title of Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors in the kingdom. In those years, Gilles's reputation was not one of a monster, but of a hero. He rode with the Maid of Orleans, stood in the company of kings and generals, and carved his name into the chronicles of the age as a nobleman of valor and distinction. For France, still suffering under the shadow of English occupation and internal strife, figures like Gilles represented hope and national pride. But the very qualities that made him remarkable on the battlefield, his commanding presence, his hunger for greatness, his sense of destiny, would later twist into something darker when his ambitions soured and his glory faded. After Joan of Arc's execution in 1431, Gilles's fortunes began to shift. The flame of France's miraculous victories dimmed, and Gilles, once a rising star, seemed to drift without purpose. He retired from military service and turned his attention to his estates, where he began to live with reckless extravagance. He spent vast sums on luxuries, lavish entertainments, and an ostentatious lifestyle that quickly drained his wealth. Chroniclers describe how he surrounded himself with musicians, actors, and servants, staging elaborate performances and indulging in excesses that strained even his immense inheritance. But Gilles's decadence was not confined to wasteful spending. Rumors began to circulate about strange practices within his castles, especially his fortress at Machecoul. Whispers of alchemy, occult rituals, and unspeakable acts seeped into the villages nearby. For a time, these rumors remained just that, murmurs about an eccentric nobleman whose tastes were odd but not necessarily criminal. Yet in the shadows, something far darker was unfolding. By the late 1430s, children began disappearing in the regions surrounding Gilles's estates. Poor families, desperate and powerless, noticed their sons and daughters vanishing after being lured into the service of Gilles's household. Some were promised work in the kitchens or as pages, others simply enticed with food and gifts. They were never seen alive again. At first, these losses were blamed on war, famine, or the dangers of rural life, but as the numbers grew, suspicion deepened. Something sinister was happening behind the high stone walls of the marshals' castles. When Gilles was finally brought to trial in 1440, the true scope of his crimes stunned France. Testimonies from servants, accomplices, and surviving witnesses painted a picture of unimaginable horror. Gilles was accused of abducting, torturing, and murdering countless children, most of them boys, but also girls, whose ages ranged from 7 to 12. The details provided during the proceedings were so ghastly that they shook even hardened judges. Witnesses described how the children were stripped, humiliated, and subjected to perverse cruelty before being killed. Some accounts claimed Gilles delighted in watching their suffering, laughing as he inflicted pain. Others told of ritualistic elements, with suggestions that he engaged in occult practices in hopes of gaining power, wealth, or pleasure from his crimes. The confessions, many corroborated by his closest associates, included stories of dismemberment, strangulation, and the disposal of bodies by burning or burying them in secret. The sheer number of victims remains uncertain. Some estimates suggest dozens, others hundreds. But whatever the true figure, it was enough to brand Gilles de Rais as one of the earliest and most infamous serial killers in European history. The trial itself became a spectacle of both horror and fascination. Gilles, once a celebrated marshal, now stood as a man broken by his own excesses and desires. At times, he raged against the accusations, claiming innocence and demanding respect for his noble rank. At other times, he seemed resigned, even repentant, acknowledging the monstrous nature of what he had done. His confessions shocked not only the court, but also the wider public. Here was a man who had once stood beside Joan of Arc, fighting for France's salvation, now revealed as a predator who had preyed upon the most vulnerable of his own people. In October 1440, Gilles de Rais was found guilty of murder, sodomy, and heresy. The sentence was death by hanging and burning, a punishment befitting the enormity of his crimes. On the day of his execution in Nantes, a massive crowd gathered to witness the fall of a man once hailed as a hero. Gilles reportedly approached his death with composure, offering repentance and prayers, seeking forgiveness for the horrors he had inflicted. Some chroniclers even noted that he died with a semblance of dignity, as though attempting to reclaim, in his final moments, some fragment of the nobility he had long since lost. As the flames consumed his body, the legend of Gilles de Rais was born, a legend that would haunt France for centuries. He became a figure of caution and fascination, a nobleman who descended into unspeakable depravity, a reminder that evil could hide beneath the gilded surface of chivalry and honor. His story raised disturbing questions. How could a man who once embodied the virtues of knighthood become a symbol of cruelty and corruption? Was he driven by madness, by lust, by greed, or by some darker hunger that defied understanding? In later centuries, Gilles's reputation intertwined with folklore. Some scholars linked him to the figure of Bluebeard, the fictional nobleman who murdered his wives, whose story became one of the most enduring fairy tales of Europe. Whether this connection was intentional or coincidental, it reflected how deeply Gilles's crimes had scarred the cultural imagination. He was remembered not merely as a historical criminal, but as an archetype of monstrous nobility, a man who betrayed every ideal of chivalry by using his power to destroy rather than protect. Modern historians have debated the extent of his guilt. Some suggest that political motives played a role in his downfall, that his wealth and lands made him a target for greedy rivals eager to see him condemned. It is true that medieval justice was far from impartial, and accusations of heresy and witchcraft were often tools used to eliminate inconvenient figures. Yet the consistency of the testimonies against him, the corroboration of details by multiple witnesses, and the discovery of human remains near his castles make it difficult to dismiss the charges as mere fabrication. While exaggerations and sensationalism certainly colored his trial, the evidence points to a man who did indeed commit atrocities on a scale that defies comprehension. The duality of Gilles de Rais's life, hero and villain, marshal and murderer, savior of France and destroyer of children, makes him one of the most disturbing figures in history. He forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can exist not just on the fringes of society, but at its very heart, wearing the trappings of honor and nobility. His story is not just one of personal corruption, but also a reflection of the darkness that can emerge in times of upheaval, when war, wealth, and unchecked power create a fertile ground for cruelty. Even today, his name lingers like a shadow over the legacy of Joan of Arc. To think that the man who once fought by her side could become a predator of children feels almost like a betrayal of history itself. Joan represented purity, faith, and sacrifice. Gilles came to symbolize corruption, depravity, and the abuse of innocence. Together, their stories form a tragic contrast, the saint and the sinner, the savior and the destroyer, forever linked in the memory of France. When we look back at Gilles de Rais, we are confronted not only with the horror of his crimes, but also with the fragility of human virtue. Here was a man raised in privilege, given every opportunity to embody the ideals of knighthood, entrusted with the fate of nations, and yet he chose a path of darkness that defies explanation. His life warns us that the boundary between glory and infamy is thin, and that within the halls of power, the seeds of monstrosity can take root and grow unseen until it is too late. His castles have long since fallen into ruin, his bones reduced to dust, but his legacy endures in the chilling tales told about him. To this day, Gilles de Rais remains one of the most infamous names in European history, a man who began as a hero of France and ended as one of its darkest villains. When we think of monsters in the medieval world, our minds immediately turn to the serial killers, the predators who stalked the weak, or the nobles who turned their power into instruments of cruelty. But to truly understand the darkest side of those centuries, we must also turn our attention to the figures who were not outlaws, but who acted in full view of society, sanctioned by law, ordered by kings, and cheered on by crowds. These were the executioners, torturers, and enforcers of medieval justice, men whose profession was to bring suffering and death not in secret, but on public stages, where punishment was transformed into spectacle. They may not have been serial killers in the traditional sense, but they carried out killings systematically, with precision and brutality, and they remind us that cruelty was not only the work of individuals in the shadows, but also of entire systems of power. The medieval period was a world in which law and order were inseparable from religion and authority. Crime was not just a violation of the peace, but a sin against God, a disruption of the divine order that had to be corrected through punishment. To punish was not only to deter others, but also to cleanse society of guilt. This gave executioners a strange, paradoxical role. Despised as outcasts, feared as bringers of death, yet absolutely necessary to the functioning of justice. They lived on the edges of society, often shunned by neighbors, forced to marry only within their own ranks, and denied normal participation in community life. Yet when the day came for punishment, they stood at the center of attention, watched by hundreds, sometimes thousands, as they carried out their grim duties. Executioners had many tasks beyond the final act of hanging or beheading. They were also responsible for torture, for extracting confessions, for mutilating criminals, for branding, flogging, or cutting off hands and tongues. In an age when truth was believed to be drawn out by pain, the torturer's tools were considered instruments of justice. The rack stretched a man's body until joints cracked. The strappado wrenched arms from their sockets. Thumbscrews crushed bone and flesh, and hot irons seared skin. These were not the inventions of sadists lurking in dungeons. They were legal devices, approved by courts, supervised by magistrates, and carried out by professionals whose job was to navigate the thin line between punishment and execution. Among the most infamous forms of public punishment was the breaking wheel, a brutal execution method reserved for the worst offenders. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, their limbs stretched across its spokes, and then struck with an iron bar until bones shattered. Sometimes the broken body was woven through the wheel and displayed high on a pole, left to rot as a warning to others. It was a slow, agonizing death, often lasting hours, and it demonstrated not only the cruelty of the punishment, but also the way medieval justice sought to turn death into a visible lesson for all who watched. Burning at the stake carried its own dreadful symbolism. Fire was seen as a purifier, a way to cleanse the soul of sin while eradicating the body of heretics and witches. Crowds gathered to watch as flames consumed the condemned, sometimes mercifully killed by strangulation before the fire was lit, other times left to scream as the blaze rose around them. The executioner, in this role, became almost a priest of punishment, delivering souls to divine judgment through fire. Hanging, by contrast, was a more common punishment for thieves, murderers, and common criminals. It might seem simple compared to the wheel or the stake, but in its medieval form it was often a long, slow process of strangulation rather than the quick nap of later times. The gallows was a place of spectacle where the condemned might give a final speech, confess sins, or curse their enemies. For the crowd, it was both entertainment and moral lesson, a reminder of the wages of sin and crime. Executioners also presided over punishments designed to humiliate rather than kill. Stocks and pillories held offenders in place in public squares, where passers-by pelted them with rotten food, filth, and stones. Floggings were carried out in marketplaces, branding irons pressed to flesh as a permanent mark of shame. In some towns, the executioner had to escort criminals through the streets, beating drums or ringing bells to draw attention to their disgrace. All of these acts were part of a larger theater of punishment, in which the executioner was both stagehand and star actor, shaping the performance of justice before the eyes of the community. Yet for all their visibility, executioners were never truly accepted. Their touch was considered unclean, their presence avoided. They lived in houses on the edges of towns, sometimes even outside the city walls. Children were warned not to go near them, and marriage into their families was avoided by respectable folk. Many executioners had to find side jobs to survive, working as knackers disposing of animal carcasses, or as tanners, professions that dealt with death and waste. The very thing that made them essential, handling the condemned, touching corpses, dealing with blood, also made them untouchable in the eyes of their neighbors. The psychological toll of such a life must have been immense. To wake each day knowing your task was to inflict suffering, to perfect the art of killing, to look into the eyes of men and women begging for mercy, and to deny it. Such things would leave scars that no one could see. Yet some executioners turned their trade into a family business, passing the profession down through generations, as though accepting that their lot was to serve society by bearing its darkest burden. One of the most notorious figures in this grim profession was Franz Schmidt, the official executioner of Nuremberg in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Unlike many of his counterparts, Schmidt kept a meticulous diary of his work, documenting over 300 executions and even more corporal punishments he carried out during his career. His notes reveal not a sadist, but a man who approached his duties with precision and a strange sense of duty, describing not only the crimes and punishments, but also the fates of those who stood before him. Schmidt later retired with honor and even became a respected citizen, showing that in rare cases, executioners could transcend the stigma of their trade. Yet even in his records, the sheer volume of suffering inflicted underlines how normalized violence had become in the justice systems of the time. Medieval torture chambers, too, reveal the creativity of cruelty that was institutionalized in this era. Devices like the Iron Maiden, though likely more symbolic than widely used, embodied the imagination of pain. Chairs studded with spikes, boots designed to crush feet, and cages that exposed victims to the elements were all part of the language of punishment. Even if not every device was as common as legend suggests, the willingness to invent them reflects a culture in which pain was not only tolerated but instrumentalized, turned into a tool for extracting truth, enforcing obedience, and instilling fear. For the people who lived in those times, public executions and punishments were not unusual. They were part of the rhythm of life. Announcements of executions drew crowds as if to a festival. Vendors sold food and drink. Children climbed on shoulders to see, and the condemned became the center of collective attention. The spectacle reinforced the power of rulers, reminding all who watched that crime and disobedience would not go unpunished. But it also served another, darker function. It allowed the people to confront their own fears, to experience horror and relief in a single moment, watching death while returning safely to their own lives. The cruelty of medieval punishment forces us to question the thin line between justice and savagery. Were executioners monsters, or were they simply men fulfilling the roles demanded by their society? Was the spectacle of the breaking wheel more barbaric than the secret cruelties of the serial killers we have already discussed? In many ways, the sanctioned brutality of the state outstripped anything committed by individuals. A lone killer might claim dozens of lives, but executioners, working in service of kings and laws, dispatched thousands over the centuries. This reality unsettles the way we think about crime and punishment. The killers of medieval times horrify us because of their secrecy and their disregard for human life. Yet the executioners horrify us in a different way because their acts were public, accepted, even celebrated. They remind us that cruelty is not always a deviation from society, but can be deeply woven into its fabric. When an entire community gathers to cheer the slow death of a condemned man, when children laugh at the humiliation of a woman in the pillory, we see not just the cruelty of one executioner, but the cruelty of a culture. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, attitudes toward punishment began to shift. Torture fell out of favor as a means of extracting truth, and public executions slowly declined in frequency. Philosophers began to argue that punishment should be swift and humane, designed not to inflict suffering, but to prevent crime. The guillotine, introduced during the French Revolution, was hailed as a more merciful alternative to the axe or the wheel, killing instantly without the prolonged agony of older methods. Yet even then, the spectacle of punishment persisted, and crowds still gathered to watch the blade fall. The legacy of medieval executioners and torturers lives on not only in history books, but also in the symbols of horror that continue to fascinate us. Images of dungeons, racks, and burning stakes haunt our imagination, embodying the darkest side of justice. They remind us that cruelty is not only the work of aberrant individuals, but can also be institutional, legalized, and celebrated by societies that believe they are righteous. In the end, the story of medieval executioners is the story of humanity's struggle with power and justice. It is easy to condemn the killers who stalked the shadows, but harder to confront the fact that entire communities once demanded pain and death as entertainment and justice. The executioner stood at the center of this paradox, reviled and needed, feared and relied upon, a man who bore the burden of society's darkest impulses while living as an outcast from the very people he served. And so, as we reflect on the most notorious killers of medieval times, we must also remember those who killed not in secret, but in the open, under the banner of law and order. Their names may not always be remembered, but their legacy is etched in the very foundations of justice, a reminder that cruelty, when sanctioned by society, becomes even more terrifying than the deeds of any lone monster. The killers of the shadows may haunt us, but the executioners remind us that the line between justice and brutality has always been dangerously thin.